Thank you for joining us today for the latest in the Deckhive Introducers webinar series. And today we're delighted to be joined by Jane Adshead-Grant, who's going to be talking to us about the listening deck. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Martin. And thank each and every one of you. I'm appreciative of you giving up your lunch break to join us here today.
Thank you. I'm sure it will be lunch break for many people here, recognizing some of the faces, but there may well be some of you who are joining from different parts of the world. We do sometimes have people get up in the middle of the night to come and join us, which is always very much appreciated, the extra effort that you go to. We try and make it as convenient as we can for as many people as possible. But these are a series of sessions that we run reasonably regularly where we get to meet the creators of some of the card decks that are in the Deckhive library and just hear a bit more about their story, about what it is that they do, why they've created a card deck and what that card deck looks like and how you can use it in your own work. So good chance to kind of get a good understanding and grounding in a particular deck and way of using it, and also a chance to ask questions as well. So we'll be having an opportunity to do that a bit later on. And in fact, if you want to see some of our previous sessions, including the one that we did with Kate back a while ago, I can't remember when it was, Kate, it was a while ago, wasn't it?
It was a real while ago. It felt like it was in lockdown. I'm not sure if it was, but yes, a little while back.
A while ago, but that is on our YouTube channel, so you can always catch up on some of those previous sessions if you would like to, and learn about some of the other decks. So if you're not familiar with Deckhive already, which I'm sure most of you are, but just a quick introduction from me around that. As you'll see in a moment when we run through the rest of the session, it's a simple platform for using a deck of cards in digital form. So whether you're working one-to-one in a coaching scenario or working with a larger group in a training facilitation kind of context, or any other kind of context actually that's relevant for you, if you want to work interactively with other people and using a deck of cards, then Deckhive is the tool to do it. You can create your own decks of cards within the system, or you can use some of the brilliant decks that we've already got in the library from creators like Jane and Kate. So please do go and have an explore of that if you haven't already. And we have a free 30-day trial on the platform, so you can get started really easily and have a play, which is certainly what we encourage you to do as a way of getting started. So the listening deck is one of the decks that we're delighted to have within the library. And it was added something I think really different and really valuable to the library here. So it's good to be able to explore that today. So by way of introduction, Jane, it'd be good to hear a bit about yourself and what your background is and how you come to this situation and you are now with having a book and a deck of cards.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. So perhaps I share with you my vision. To start with, I imagine a world where we listen first, enabling others to stand up to and into who they're meant to be. I believe that for people to feel valued is to be listened to be fully understood and heard for who they are as a human being, not just what they do. And so everything I do is underpinned by what I perceive one of the most fundamental skills that we have as a human being. So as an executive coach, I support leaders developing a human-centered approach to leadership. Again, the foundational skill of that being listening. And as a leadership facilitator, hosting leadership away days and opportunities for leaders to come together to discover more about who they are, to grow as human beings and grow their business. Again, that work is underpinned and delegates experience what it feels like to be truly listened to and also to master the skills of listening themselves. And finally, I teach generative listening. And I do that through the Time to Think program. Some of you may well be familiar. Yes, I can see some nods from Linda, Catherine. Nancy Klein's beautiful work has been a huge underpinning of my work, and in fact the deck itself from my work and learnings and discoveries with Nancy.
So when you say generative listening, then what would that mean for someone who doesn't understand that concept?
Lovely question, and we'll get to share that with you on one of the introduction to what's in the deck. Generative listening is a way of being. It's a different kind of listening. It's a listening where we generate the finest thinking and expression of feelings in another. So through our way of being, listening free of interruption, free of judgment, which is the critical element here, enables people to feel seen, heard, and understood.
So yeah, I'm guessing that's something that doesn't happen very often unless people are really encouraged to be like that.
It's so true, Martin. You know, I feel that we live in a world where people, our kind of default is that we listen to reply. We listen to analyze, to evaluate, to, you know, even kind of come back with our own opinion, whether it's asked for or not. And so we're used to this, listening to reply in every aspect of conversation, and, you know, even in coaching, you know, that sometimes people are busy listening to think about what's the next question I'm going to ask. Whereas generative listening is to relax and to be thinking about, you know, a listening where we're helping the listener understand themselves more fully so that they can flourish and think as themselves, rather than being dependent and conforming on what they think I want to hear as the coach or the leadership facilitator. But it's true. It's, you know, we live in a world that's peppered with interruption and listening to reply rather than seeking to generate and ignite the best thinking in others.
So I imagine that's quite a powerful thing when people experience that for the first time, to kind of realize maybe some of that baggage that they have, or the roles that they kind of default to in a conversation that don't have to be that way.
It is. And actually, I would say it can be radical. In my experience, it takes a while to get used to being listened to in this way because they're not used to it. But when they do, they rarely want to have anything else. And because it creates amazing results.
Yeah. So yeah, and I guess it's such a big change for a lot of people. So do you find that people are very receptive to it and also able to change very readily once they know how to change? Is it something that you find relatively easy to kind of make progress with, or is it something that takes a lot of time and effort to kind of be able to be a better listener?
Well, it's such a great question. And my experience is that it's kind of context led. So individuals who want to deepen their leadership, who want to improve their communication, who want to enjoy more robust relationships, listening is, you know, the golden key to all of those things. And therefore they're really open to it. They're willing, you know, I've just been coaching a client this morning, a leadership client, and, you know, he's just transformed his leadership because of his development in this space. And he was open and willing to adapt and learn. There are others where it's more difficult and challenging because it's not what they're used to, nor is it what they get rewarded for. You know, when we're working in a corporate environment, often we're not rewarded for listening. Rather, it's who can speak the loudest, who can come up with the, you know, the quickest idea, rather than that person who has had the opportunity to take some time to listen to others, to form their view, and to contribute to a conversation thoughtfully, and, you know, with compassion. I think the world is changing, and so I've seen I am receiving more and more requests for workshops, leadership facilitation, teamwork on listening specifically. Can you come and run a listening session? I want a listening session. That's and developing listening skills, which is why I'm so excited to be with you all today, because it's definitely an increasing request.
Yeah, and I guess more and more people are not being heard because we have so many distractions, don't we? Now with teenage children, you get very used to the amount of distractions that are available to us and how difficult it can be to turn those things off sometimes. So I know you had the book and you've got the deck of cards. So which came first?
Oh, kind of concurrently, actually. So I was writing the book, and the card idea was one of my delegates. I run a listening challenge, and one of the delegates on one of my first listening challenges saying, gosh, this is so fun, why don't you think about having a card deck? So I was inspired by somebody who's discovered my work, and as I was writing the book, I was in touch with a wonderful illustrator, and it kind of came together. So they were kind of in parallel.
So do you want to tell us a bit more about the book? Is that helpful to say about that now, or would you prefer to say about it later?
Sure, happily to. So The Listening Coach is the book. And this is my second book on listening. The first is Are You Listening or Just Waiting to Speak, which was a shorter book. This book was written again as requested by another who had experienced my work and asked me if I'd write a book that was almost more workbooky. Could you provide us some opportunities for some practical application of what you share? So The Listening Coach, coach yourself through elements of listening that are critical in life, business, and our communities. And so the book is, it's sharing everything I'm going to share on the listening deck. But there are some key points, sort of exercises at the end of every chapter, and even a blank page for people to collect their notes. It's also peppered with real life experiences, my own coaching client conversations to share how listening has impacted their life, and also some interviews with some key leaders, focusing on the three contexts of listening, both at work, life, and in our communities.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll see the connections to that with the deck then, won't we? So is it now a good time maybe for me to share my screen so we can see some of the cards in the deck and for you to talk us through the structure of how it all fits together?
That would be wonderful.
So there we go. So we put a couple of cards from each of the different types of cards. What do you call them? Categories or?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to, would that be helpful for me to share with you?
Yeah, to give us a sense of each of the different types of cards we have here.
Wonderful. So I guess the high level thing is just to share my overall purpose. Why this deck? Well, I created this deck on the basis I wanted to provide people with a fun and meaningful way to discover and deepen their skills and experience of listening. And so it is based upon my book, as we've just talked about, and as also shared, it's hugely underpinned by my work with Nancy Klein, together with my own research. And one of the things that really drives people's awareness to this is some of the research around listening, in that, research suggests that we spend over 80% of our time in communication in our lives. And of that, 45% is involved in listening. And particularly listening at work. And then anyone who's in a senior leadership role will be spending up to 80% of their time listening. And these are the statistics that seem to wake people up, to wake them up to the idea that, listening is fundamental. And the sad thing is that of that senior leadership group, where 80% of their time is listening to discern and gather new information, to make decisions, to engage their team members, to innovate new ideas, only 2% invest in listening skills and developing, what we perceive to be an innate skill. And yet actually there's so much more. So that's why I shared it. And what you see here is an example of what's in the deck. And my invitation to any of you using this for yourself is first off to familiarize yourself with the cards, what's in there. So the green ones, and if you want to flip these over, the green backed cards, as you can see, each category has a different color backing. They are the listening skills. And what I love about the way that we can do this on Deckhive, we can have some fun by sharing the back and then flipping them over, because that in itself brings a kind of interest, what is behind this card. So here are just two examples of listening skills. I propose that, a skill of not interrupting is critical. And so each card is, what's the skill, and then an image to bring that to life, to really apply to different learning styles, and then a short description of what I mean by that. And then the other one is giving your attention in terms of what does that look like, keeping a gentle eye contact and an open body posture, for example. And the beauty of Deckhive, one can do this as so those of you who may be familiar with this, or for those less so, is the ease with which we can move these cards around to bring them up to the fore. So again, as a facilitator, one could use this as, just highlighting them, bringing them up, letting people read them and see them for themselves. But we'll come on to other activities in just a minute. I've created this deck in a structure that would support facilitators, coaches, leaders, parents, mentors, anyone who is involved in one-on-one, not one-on-one, group work, and you can use this one-on-one, you can use it in a coaching session, but anyone who is in the business of personal and professional development, perhaps in focusing on leadership, communication, and also in education. You know, if we have teachers in the room, I'm thrilled for these to be shared within schools, for example.
Okay, so excuse me. So on the left-hand side, we've got the different subdecks within the deck. So if we click on the green one, we get to see all of those cards that relate to the listening skills. Likewise, click on the blue one and we get to see the levels of listening cards, and we can flip them all over at once and back again very easily like that. So so levels of listening then is our second subdeck. So what do we have in here?
So yes, this is, again, we'll share the whole thing, but just to give you a couple of examples here, I talk about understanding the fact that as a human being, we'll be listening at different levels. And I propose that we can be listening at different levels at any one time, and in fact, in any one conversation. And the idea is to become familiar with the levels of listening and their purpose, and actually how we want to develop and deepen our skills. And it begins with listening to self. To be a great listener of others, we need to be able to listen well to ourselves, to pause and get really present, to notice what we're saying to ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, and asking ourselves questions. And so once we begin to master the art of listening to self, we can then be more present and develop further listening for others. So we begin at self-listening, and then I would call the ultimate level of listening as generative listening. Listening to free the mind rather than direct it, to ignite the finest thinking in others. And generative listening it requires us to be a certain way. It's not what we're doing as much as what and how we are being. We are being, giving our attention. We are not interrupting. So this is where we get to the generative listening, and you'll see later I share and help people understand the different levels of listening and to think about where might I sit, where might you sit, and where do I want to move to?
Okay, so then the third section we've got is the orange one for the listening biases. So what do we have here?
Yes, so this is each and every one of us will hold a number of biases. Again, we'll go into a little bit more detail shortly on that. So just to share with you, there are 5 different biases to understand, you know, what gets in the way. What gets in the way of us listening well to another? And these are really critical because for me, in order for us to develop and become better listeners, we have to be aware of what gets in our way. So that's what the listening biases are.
Fab. I'll just move those back out the way.
Thank you.
And the listening principles?
Yeah, so once we've identified what our biases are, what are the principles that we could adopt in order to overcome, to mitigate those biases? Now we have 5 biases, and yet we have 7 principles. And so the idea is that one could mix different principles with different biases. This is very self-directed learning, and I will always encourage people to think about, what do you most identify with? So here are just a couple of principles in order for us to mitigate our biases, is to think about, for example, one being self-aware. You know, notice when I fall out of listening, when I'm just simply pretending. Listening for potential and possibility. You know, this is perhaps addressing a certain bias where we think we know all the answers. Rather, let's listen for what's possible from another. So when we apply these principles, we can become even better listeners.
Okay, and finally, we have the red cards.
Yeah, so we have just 3 contexts, and this is really a reflection of my own life. So I was thinking about, you know, where does listening show up? And my own route to listening is I trained as an executive coach more than 20 years ago now, but prior to that, I'd had 16 years in a people-focused role, always in kind of personnel, and then it became HR. And so for me, listening at work was critical. It was something that I didn't know that I had a deep association with. And then as I trained as a coach, I learned all about, reflective listening and active listening. And it wasn't until I met with Nancy did I discover this beautiful art of generative listening that took my whole work to a different level. And equally, it took my home life, hence another area we talk about, listening at home. The mum I was, the sister I am, I still am a mum, by the way, the mum I am, the sister, the wife, the best friend, my listening in my personal life deepened my relationships, unquestionably. And my daughters will share that regularly. And then equally in the community, I do some work in a local prison. That's probably one of the hardest things I have done. And listening in that environment was, well, it's incredible. I feel privileged to do it, and yet it's very difficult. And so it's wonderful for deepening and, listening free of judgment. So being in my community, I do other work in the community, but that is one that really made me think about the impact we can have listening in our community.
So it's, we know from the research that doing things for other people and giving to other people is really important for our well-being. But it strikes me from what you're saying there and what you're describing, really, that's maybe one of the best ways to give to somebody is to give your attention in that way.
That's just beautiful, Martin. And in fact, further research is coming out about attention. Marcus Buckingham, some of you may be familiar with him and his latest book, where is it? I just had it here. Yes, Love and Work. I'm kind of partway through reading it, but he talks about people don't want feedback anymore. They want attention. They want your attention. And we know as parents, our kids, that's what they want most of all. But the impact attention has on another is significant. In some would say an attention deficit world.
Yeah. I'm not sure my children want my attention. I think they just want likes, don't they?
Well, maybe that's a different form of attention. But, yeah.
Probably. Okay, fab. So there we are. So there are 5 different types of card that we have in the deck. And as I was saying before, you click on the subdeck there, and that opens the deck, and we can scroll through, choose any that we want, drag them onto the table. So that functionally is how it works. But of course, if we're working in a group, then within Deckhive, we can have everybody in that same space, so everybody can be choosing their own card. So it's interesting you're saying about this being largely self-guided. So I guess there's a lot of choice that rests with the individual within a group situation about which cards they're drawn to and where they want to go with that. So do you want to give us some examples then of how we might be able to make use of the deck if we were working with a group? Where might we start?
Yes, wonderful. Well, as I mentioned, the first thing I'd love to do is to invite everyone who is going to be leading this is to familiarize yourself first as a facilitator with the deck, so you know what's on there. And in practice, I've used them in, or rather I have used them in large groups, whereby we go into different activities using smaller groups. What I mean by that is, for example, we might, on Deckhive we can do this, is to open up a room. And for this particular example, we're going to be looking at listening skills. So what I might say to a group, what I do say to groups, is to, pair off in 2s or maybe a small group of 3. And looking at the skills, so we might have the skills open, or people might do it randomly, however fun you want to make this. But choose up to 3 skills. So that's beautiful. Just as you go through here, have a look at these skills. So we just give them a moment to think about them and to think, okay, which are the 3 that I identify most with? Those that I know I'm not particularly good at and I'd like to get better. So, I've never thought about encouragement as a key skill of listening. Well, being a great listener is enabling the person to keep talking. And so therefore, how do we encourage them? And so I will invite people to choose 3 kind of, 2 or 3 cards. And then of those 3, let's just pick on one of them. So, and I love it to be self-directed. So think about what is it that you most identify with? And then I'll be asking a question for the group to connect with. with each other. So imagine now we're in this room together and there are 2 other people with us. I would use the sticky note here. Martin's already created one for us, the yellow sticky. We can just draw across and create a question. And the question, the sorts of questions I'll be asking is, of the skill that you chose, or of the, of these you choose, what do you want to amplify, extend, or expand? And now begin to practice some listening. Let's do real life listening. So in your group, using the visuals that you've got here, one of you or 2 of you listen to the other one sharing. Okay, so I really want to extend my encouragement. Okay, so tell us more about that. So we get to work in a smaller group. And then at the end of the discussion, invite someone. Again, we've got a little pinky note here to say, so what are you going to do now? Having had this opportunity to think about it. The beautiful thing about working in a small group is we learn from each other. So, somebody might have chosen silence as their key thing, and others, God, that's so what I need to do. And we learn of different ways of getting more comfortable with silence because of the conversation we've been part of. So I'm a big fan of working in small groups and then come back into the bigger group to share 1 or 2 key thoughts.
Okay. So then how would we relate these things to the biases? Because as you said earlier, that they very much kind of link together in that sense. So is there something you can say around that?
Yeah, so what I've noticed in this card deck and these different exercises is that each group I work with, different people in the group respond to different cards, like what really stands out for them. Some people, it's like the skills. Oh, this one, the biases seem to land with every group I've done this work with. So the biases is the question to start us, well, where do we get stuck? Or what stops us listening well? Here are the 5 biases. And I would say, so Martin, if you could be, for example, choose a bias as you look through that. We've got the opinionator who's just sharing his ideas and squashing everybody else's. We've got the grouch who's simply not interested in listening. The solutioner who just jumps in before the person's even finished. I can see Linda smiling. This is wonderful because this is what happens the minute I start to share what we mean by these biases. People readily identify with, either for themselves, oh, that's me, or that's my husband, or that's my boss, or that's my team member. So what I really like about the biases is that I've tried to make them very relatable, again, research-based, but relatable. And it is very fun to see people like, oh, yeah, that's me. And the thing I'd love to say here is that these biases, we all have them. There are always times, I practice listening every day. It's what I do, but I still fall into this occasionally. And there might be times when I simply don't want to listen. I become a grouch, like, no, just give me some time out. But I'm, confessing this is me. I'm still work in progress. And so that to get familiar with the biases. So I would say to an individual, a group again, I like to have them in a small group, go on this page and then pick, a bias that you relate to and share your experiences. When does this emerge for you? What are the kind of circumstances you find yourself in? What would change if you were able to mitigate that bias? Okay, so we've got out on the table now, this is confession time, okay? And I kind of try and make it fun. Solution, Martin, this is probably one of the most popular ones that people fess up to. And, in reality, as a human being, we're wired to solve problems.
Yeah. And I guess also then it's valuable sometimes to think about, when don't you fall into that trap? When do you manage to suppress that deliberately or without effort and naturally avoid that temptation?
Very much.
There's always times, aren't there, when we do things better or don't fall into those bad habits.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's when we're surrounded by people who don't, and again, I was with my client earlier and he was saying, I've really been observing one of the senior leaders that's just joined our organization. And he just observes. He observes. And then he makes a short comment, he doesn't do a lot. He's a really senior leader. I said, but, what he does contribute is masterful because he spent so much time listening and observing and noticing. And so my leader, who's, my client who's working up to that exec level, is like, oh. So when we surround ourselves with people who are really good at this, we can resist the urge, to fall into these traps, as you said, all these biases.
Thank you. Okay, so and we had a few more cards on the fourth table.
We did, and just go back for a second, if I may, on the third one, just one last thing on that one. So we've talked about biases. What we could do on this table as well, we could invite people to think about, well, what are the principles? In order to mitigate the biases, we could get them to draw out some of the purple-backed cards. And, in my book, I do give examples. This is how my book brings it all alive. Again, it's real life stories, and people are demonstrating the biases. And then I share some principles. But I'm not wedded to these. These are ideas and thoughts, so if you're a solutioner, the listening for potential bias, principle will really help overcome the need to always solutionize for people. So if you adopt this principle, listening for potential and possibility, for example, it could also be, appreciating others, that could also help you when you've got in mind somebody who comes to you with a problem, is first of all to think about, gosh, what are they good at? Who are they as a human being? If you saw them as a resourceful, intelligent, capable human being, you might hold back from trying to solutionize. So, we could bring a couple of principles together to help us mitigate that. But I'm always wanting to bring these cards alive by inviting small groups to engage in conversation, because we learn by being in community with each other. And also, we begin to practice our listening by the very art of being in this session.
Yeah. Did you often find that people will join a session about listening and then kind of not listen, maybe too much, and sort of get caught up in some of these biases and bad habits, and not kind of make the connection so obviously that they're there to learn about listening?
Well, it's a great observation. What I found is that people will relate to a specific, like a card or a grouping. But the most powerful thing is the group learning from each other. Often when I'll finish a session, I'll say, so, what has made this time really valuable for you? And they'll say, gosh, I always interrupt people. I'm blown away by now knowing that when I interrupt someone, it's as if I'm physically assaulting them. Or the bias of a solutioner, the bias is really got me in the way, or a pretender. Yeah, I'm a constant pretender, some gentleman said the other day. So what I notice is that these sessions wake people up. It's like, the amount of people that said, I thought I was a good listener until I came on one of your programs, or until I read your book.
So how often do people have the self-awareness to be able to recognize where maybe they fall down sometimes because you've prompted them? And how often do they need that feedback, which kind of points out that maybe they don't listen as much as they thought they did, or maybe they do jump to some of these conclusions that they hadn't previously realized they did?
Gosh, that's such a great question. And the reality is that I only get them for a moment in their working time. They're working, so I get them for a set period. So whether it's an hour or it's a half-day workshop. So, I observe and I notice they're listening from the get-go. I would say on the majority of the time, these cards are so relatable and easy, everything. I try and keep it simple and easy and practical. And because of that combination, people identify and relate to them very quickly. So it's, it's like, oh, this is me. Oh yeah, now my daughter tells me about that all the time. So my experience is that people become aware once they see what's in the deck. They identify with it.
Yeah. Okay, so should we move on to table 4?
Yes.
So what do we see here? Levels of listening.
So levels of listening, I love to describe this as part of a sort of educative piece. And this is just a framework that I came up with in thinking about, again, my own listening, really, in terms of, I would say that we're involved in any one of these levels of listening. And whilst they're not hierarchical, even though we call them levels, is the fact that you can be in any one of these. Hence, I like to draw it as a circle. And we move from self-listening, and I put pretend listening in there, not that that's one I want people to subscribe to, but the reality is that we all fall out of listening, and we all pretend at some point. I'm sure you can relate to this. If not someone you've been in conversation with and you can tell they're not really listening. My husband does this from time to time, even though he knows I write about this stuff, but he doesn't mind. He'll always quote himself. He's in one of my books, and because it's true and it's what we experience. And so, I share this as a kind of what not to do, but the reality is we can't help it. There'll be times when we are distracted, our mind goes, but the key thing is then to bring ourselves back. So that's why I call that one in there. Another level of listening is factual listening. There'll be times when we need to know the information. We need to gather information on which to make a decision, to discern what to do. Is this a coaching moment? Is this a moment of mentoring? Or is this a time for me to be direct? So listening for the facts and the figures to help understand further. And then we move, and to me, whilst I've said they're not hierarchical, they do increase in skill. So to move from factual listening to empathetic listening, which I'm sure most of you, well, not most, all of you will be familiar with here, is this idea of, listening to the non-verbal cues, the feelings of another, and acknowledging somebody both for the facts and the feelings. Now, you may not get the feelings right from what you've picked up. And so the language you use may be, and I sense this is how you might be feeling as a result of that, or, what I heard was this. But the fact that you have observed the feeling and, share that with another really does shift the connection. And then the generative listening this is when we see another human being as a resourceful, smart, capable human being, where we give them the opportunity to step up to and into who they're meant to be. We're listening with a view of wonderment, or listening to, gosh, where might you go next with your story? Where might you go next with what you want to accomplish for yourself? What are you thinking now? As I hold that space and encourage you to keep sharing your thoughts and expressing yourself.
Thank you. So, and how would the concept of clean listening, is that the right phrase? Clean language, sorry. So that kind of fits with, sort of resonates a bit with some of what you've talked about there. Is that something you talk about at all or do you use different language?
I don't. I mean, it's beautiful. I think that clean language is beautiful work. And I think, there's some really lovely overlaps with time to think and clean language. I think it's a beautiful concept in the sense of we will use the language of another, their words. In my experience, words matter. And one of the things we'll look at, certainly in the skills of generative listening, I don't talk about it in my book because it's complex, but I teach it on my programs. I do talk about it a little bit, but the nature of assumptions. And so, using people's language, using their words is critical because, we might use the same word, but there's a very different meaning attached to it. I was talking with my daughter just this week, sharing a conversation about debate, and she loves a debate. And finds it very powerful and very engaging and very open-minded, very, it's a wonderful way to learn. And I come from a different perspective. The word debate for me conjures up, sometimes can be disrespectful. I can feel it really threatening. And she was interested in my perspective as I was in hers, and we could see where each other were coming from, but we were at different ends of the spectrum of agreeableness and disagreeableness. But the word debate conjured up an unpleasant experience from my life experience, seeing the political debates. I can't bear them. Whereas hers loved it. So this is, well, what do we mean by debate? But if we were to call it time talk, which what we do in the thinking environment, it's all about listening, then it's totally where I'm at. But just the word debate, turn me off. But now I understand it differently. I have a different worldview about it.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Okay, so is there anything else that you would want to share in terms of other suggestions for people who want to get started to use the listening deck and embrace this kind of topic if they haven't done it before?
Well, I'd love to say there's some additional resources. So on my website, thelisteningcoach.co.uk, the cards one can buy, there is a physical copy as well. I use these with clients, and they take a deck away with them. So that feedback is that they've loved the physical copy. But why I love the Deckhive is that increasingly our world is shifting, or has shifted as well, to a lot of online learning. And that's why I love this option. So if I'm hosting an online leadership or communication listening skills workshop, this is the way forward. But if you're in person, that's available. On my website, there is a free download for 10 activities to use with how you would use these cards with others, some of which I've shared here, but others. And you can download that for free, without even buying the card deck. So 2 of them are working one-on-one, and 8 of them are working in groups.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Well, in a moment, I'm going to open up for questions. If anyone's got any questions they'd like to ask Jane, so feel free to add them into the chat, or just to unmute yourself in a moment and ask away. While you're having a think about what questions you'd like to ask, I'm just going to quickly leave this session in Deckhive just to show you a couple of things in here that might well be useful to help you navigate when you come to have a play around. So if you go to the library and scroll down, then you find the listening deck here, and you click on that, and then that's where you can see a bit more about the deck, where you'll be able to watch the replay of this session once I've got that recording in there. And in fact, you've also got that same download that Jane was just talking about there, which you can access here if you're on one of the paid plans on Deckhive. And you can also click here. So if you don't remember Jane's web address, you can click through here and visit her website through this route as well, and find her on social media. But as I was saying before, we have lots of different decks available within the Deckhive library. So feel free to have a scroll through here and find out what else could be useful for you and the people you're working with. So the cards for clear thinking that Kate here has kindly put into our library too. So this is just one of the other decks that's available. So feel free to go and check those out. But I would also point you towards the blue menu at the bottom of the website, where we have some tutorials and some FAQs. So if you get stuck with anything or need a bit of guidance on how to use the system, then that's a good place to start. But as usual, my advice is to just go and have a play and practice, and invite friends, family, colleagues to join you in a real-time session, so you can get familiar with the functionality about how you would actually use this. The last thing you want to do really is to be having an important session where you want to be listening to your clients and giving them the space to talk and to listen themselves, and to be hung up on figuring out the functionality, which buttons to press. So get that stuff sorted beforehand, so you're super confident and comfortable with the platform is definitely my advice. So let me just stop my screen share for a moment. I can share it again later if necessary. So have we got any questions already? I don't know whether you spot any there, Jane, or feel free to ask away if there are any that are pressing. I know we've covered a lot, but sometimes these things stimulate other questions. So feel free to ask if there are some.
Jane, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say I really love the look of your cards, and I can't wait to have a better look at them when I get back into Deckhive, because obviously we've been here a little while and are quite conversant with how it all works. But yeah, they look brilliant. So thank you for sharing that. It's excellent, really good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Catherine's asking, how would you explain what this is to others thinking about doing a session? So do you want to say a bit more about that, Catherine? Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, we do mental health and wellbeing training, and we have a number of leaders who do some of our organizational wellbeing, and I'm just thinking of linking some of this to some of the work we already do. And then a client may say, so, well, I guess it goes tons with outcomes, how, the client's thinking, how is this going to benefit me? So there's some useful kind of key messages, I guess, that we can use to encourage others to think about this as a worthwhile activity for them.
And Catherine, thank you for that. Do you mean this being investing in deepening their listening skills, or coming to on specifically this kind of approach?
I think both of them. I think what I'm finding, particularly this year, is leadership not necessarily giving themselves the time to work on this area. And so I find myself having to do a lot of convincing that it's important. So it's how do we get that? I guess it's how do we get that buy-in? I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the stats are interesting. I think maybe using, you said, leaders spend 80% of their time listening. So maybe there's something about the importance of your role and listening, and how powerful and what a difference it would make in the workplace and outside the workplace.
Oh, hugely so. And the way that I would typically engage leaders is invite them to share with me their current reality. So, how would you describe your current reality? How would you just, for example, for me, many of my leaders are talking about it's hugely unpredictable, they're very uncertain, they don't know, and so they're feeling very uncomfortable. And so helping people identify with where they are now and what it is that would enhance their capacity to thrive in such an environment is to keep learning. And the best way to keep learning is to keep listening. And if we're listening, how do we listen in such a way that we can learn to become more adaptable, more agile? So often the way that I most engage people in this work is to invite them to share with me their current reality. And I have people say things like, I'm struggling to engage my team. I don't have time, or I'm not communicating very well, or I've just had some feedback that says da da da. And so when they begin to share things that there's a bit of a gap, and then I pop in the idea that, listening and investing in that, and then the research can really help them. This is when they really engage with it. What do you now think, Catherine?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yeah, it was just to get some, because my head's kind of spinning with lots of ideas. Yeah. I'm just trying to think of connecting it with what the work we already do and the struggles we have in pinning down leaders who about 80% of the time say, I don't have time to do a session. It's like, come on, give yourself permission to have time, is what I often encourage leaders to do. Give yourself permission to make space for you, because you're doing so much for others that you're not actually giving yourself anything.
Totally. We didn't hear you, but I managed to lip read. I think that was Jane's question on, have you ever used this?
That's impressive.
Jane, it's a beautiful question. And, I don't work with children professionally, but funnily enough, I had this experience where a friend of mine came over from the States, and as I hadn't seen him for a while, he used to work with me many years ago, and he came over with his 2 teenage children. And as a gift, I gave them a book and 2 copies of my cards. To see their reaction, Jane, blew my mind. They grabbed the cards without me even asking. They opened them up, they flipped them out like this, and they just started to pull different cards. Hey, Mum, this is you. You're always interrupting you. Oh, Ryan, this is what you do. And suddenly I just saw this incredible conversation connection emerge across this family with these cards, totally self-guided. And so I felt huge inspiration and hope from 2 boys aged 12 and 14. The way they engaged with the cards was amazing.
Oh, that's great to hear. Because I work with trainee teachers who teach in primary and nursery. So I can see how I can use it with them, but I'm excited to look at your online activities and the different activities that you've got to see if they can use it with their pupils.
Yes, they may need a little bit more explanation for the younger children.
Yeah.
But some of the images are self-explanatory, which is kind of fun, and they'll relate to the no distractions one is a classic,
Okay, great, thank you.
And do you find that it's that the bad habits around listening are formed at a very young age, or do you think it's later in life where we, in a work environment where we kind of pick these things up because we've got other pressures on us. Have you ever given that much thought?
Yes, I think it's a lovely question, Martin, and I think it's twofold. I think one, we don't focus on listening in education. You know, we teach people how to speak, we teach people how to write and how to read. So we never give it a thought, although that's beginning to shift. You know, I'm talking to some young teachers, people who are talking about the way they bring mindfulness into schools now. It's part of the curriculum, which is wonderful, because that's a kind of listening to self. So I think the education is a place to start. So this would be, you know, wonderful for this to get into schools. I think it's also context specific. If you've grown up in a family where you are, you know, seen and not heard, that's tough. And so people they grow up with, you know, I don't matter, my voice doesn't matter until I get to a certain hierarchy and then I can speak. And then if we're working go into a corporate or a working environment where, you know, your ideas don't matter, so until there's something of value, I'm not going to listen to you, you know, and hierarchy gets in the way and people compete with one another and you just see poor listening habits. You think, well, the only way to survive is to, you know, interrupt or to make a judgment. We're stuffed. And so, you know, that's why some of this work has been so revealing for people and have shifted their leadership and performance and results, because they've discerned and learned the art of listening, radically transformed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I can certainly see the value in trying to bring this in an earlier stage. And as Deb's saying, to use with our families as well. I think that's a great idea. Lucy was just asking again about the link to find the activities. So obviously through Deckhive, you can click on the link to the listening deck from the library and then find the link to the resources there. But Jane, do you want to say again about your own website and where people can go there?
Yes, so on the listeningcoach.co.uk, there's a tab called the listening deck. And if you go into the listening deck, it'll tell you all about it. I think you do then have to press buy the cards. That'll take you to the next deck, the next page. But you don't have to buy the cards, and then you'll see a free download. So it's just clicking a couple of times to get the free download.
I think we're up against time now. So thank you, Jane. It's been really interesting and fascinating to listen to you talk. I guess it maybe doesn't sit so comfortably as someone who's primed to spend all your time listening, to be the one in the spotlight doing all the talking. So thank you for doing that and sharing your work and this beautiful deck that you've created. And I'm sure we'll all find ways to use it going forwards, and look forward to hearing about what's in the pipeline and what else you'll develop in the future as well.
Thank you. And I'd love to give a big shout out to Kat Hayes, my illustrator. She was stunning. Her work is making it look so beautiful.
Thank you. Okay, well, hopefully we'll see some of you again at a future session. So I know we've got a few more Deckhive Introduces coming up in the next few months. So do keep an eye out for those, and we'll circulate the recording as soon as we can after today's session. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.